Okay, this is video B of the cerebrovascular system, and we're going to go into more detail about the cerebrovascular system in this video and then the next video. So the cerebrovascular system starts off, or gets its supply from this common carotid artery that's going to ascend up from the heart region, and then it's going to branch into the external carotid artery and the internal carotid artery. The internal carotid artery is one of the arteries that's going to be supplying the brain, one of the main arteries. The other main artery that supplies the brain is the vertebral artery. And this ascends up through the vertebral column and comes up and ends up supplying most of the posterior region of the brain. So as we discuss the anatomy of the cerebrovascular system, I'm going to divide it into two main regions, the internal carotid system and the vertebrobasilar system. And we'll talk about the internal carotid system first. Actually, first we'll talk about, okay. So this gives you an idea of what we're going to talk about for the internal carotid system. So on the right here we have a diagram, so maybe I'll start here because it's a little bit easier to see the structures. So we have an internal carotid artery coming through here, and I'm going to go through each of these main arteries here, but we have three of them that we can talk about right from the start before we even go into our diagram. One is the anterior cerebral artery. That's this artery right here. And the anterior cerebral artery on this diagram is here, and it's going to supply the medial portions of the cerebral hemispheres. And then we have our middle cerebral artery, which I've identified by green arrows here, and that's going to end up supplying this more anterior portion. This is, in case it's not clear, this is an inferior view, just as this is an inferior view. And then this is, lateral and medial. That should be obvious. And then we have the posterior cerebral artery, which is shown here. And that's going to end up supplying more posterior regions on the inferior surface. Now you need to keep in mind that this only shows the inferior surface, and some of these arteries are also going to supply lateral and more superior regions. But right now this diagram is just concentrating on those regions. So that just gives you an overview of main areas they supply. We're going to go through these arteries as they come up from here, fuse into this, and then go into the cerebral arterial circle. And how we're going to do that is on a diagram first, and then we're going to go back to our anatomy after that. So if you can get out your handouts, we're going to start going through this one by one. And how this is going to work is I'm going to bring up a number on the slide, and then I'm going to be writing notes off to the side about each of those arteries. So just so you know what we're doing. So the first one we're going to talk about is labeled there. That is the internal carotid artery. I'm just going to put A for artery so I don't have to write it out each time. So that's our big artery that's coming up and to supply the brain. And that's going to split, as you can tell, to form another a number of other arteries. So our next artery we're going to talk about is the anterior cerebral artery. That's number 2. Davis, is my handwriting big enough? Okay. All right, so this comes off the internal carotid. As you can see, here's the internal carotid artery, and one of the branches is going to be this anterior cerebral artery. And this is going to supply the medial aspects of the cerebral hemisphere. Aspects. So it's going to go up through the longitudinal fissure. To supply those areas. So this anterior cerebral artery is important for supplying areas that are important for lower limb sensation and movement. As well as other things too. So one other thing that they're important for supplying are parts of the basal nuclei. So these are going to be deep branches of this anterior cerebral artery, and also parts of the hypothalamus. And why I'm talking about this, I'm going to go off here on a tangent in a little bit and tell you that each of these arteries has a cortical aspect, not each of them, but a lot of them, a cortical aspect where it's going to supply the cortex. Remember, the cerebral cortex is that 6-layered structure of gray matter that surrounds the surface of the brain. A lot of these arteries, however, also have deep branches. And those deep branches are going to supply subcortical areas, so areas that are deep to the cortex. And our anterior cerebral artery, that's what these are. So the lower limb sensation and movement, that's going to be because it supplies both the primary somatosensory cortex as well as the primary motor cortex. Certain parts of it, only the medial aspects, which I'll get into later on in the lecture. And then the deep ones are going to be the basal nuclei and parts of the hypothalamus. So our next artery is this one right up here. And it has a nice name because it tells you exactly what it does. This is called the anterior communicating artery. And so the anterior communicating artery is going to connect the right and left sides of the cerebral arterial circle. So that has a nice simple function. And then we're going to go on to number 4. Number 4, as you can see, is another branch of this internal carotid artery. And number 4 is the middle cerebral artery. This also has cortical and deep branches. So the cortical branches are going to supply the lateral surface of the cerebral hemispheres. And so it turns out that this middle cerebral artery, the cortical parts of it, are going to be important for supplying somatosensory and motor areas of the face and upper body, is one of the things that is going to be important. So face and upper body, somatosensation, so like touch, and movement. And I'll get into more specifics in a few slides, so that's going to help you there. This also supplies the very tip, or I'll just going to put very medial aspect of the temporal lobe. Okay, so that's our middle cerebral artery. So that's the cortical stuff. There's also deep branches. I'm going to just draw it over here so it's nearby. So if you were in class, I would ask you, what do you think the deep branches are going to supply? And you would answer subcortical structures. And so you would be absolutely right, and I would be so happy that you're paying attention. So these deep branches of the middle cerebral artery are going to supply parts of the internal capsule And the internal capsule is a massive white matter structure, so it's full of axons that are carrying information all over the place. You'll learn more about it later. Where am I? Internal capsule, part of the basal nuclei. Which have important motor functions. And I think that's all I wanted to say about the middle cerebral artery. So that is number 4. Coming off of number 4, you can see over here is 4A. Davis, is it going to mess you up if I write over here too? Okay, so 4A. So these are these little branches that are coming off here. And these are lenticulostriate arteries. And while we're here, I want to point out, so these come off at a very sharp angle. This is a right angle here, and these are very tiny arteries. So these are actually a place where there's a lot of times occlusions or clots here. Because of the turn here, as well as the narrow diameter of these arteries, they're often involved in cerebrovascular accidents. So what do they supply? They supply basal nuclei, and they also supply the internal capsule. So primarily subcortical structures for these lenticulostriate arteries. Okay, and then for B, I'm going to have to go over here and change my slide. There it is. This is called the anterior choroidal artery. And this supplies the choroid plexus. Another term that you guys will become very familiar with. Plexus. I'm not sure how you spell it. Supplies the choroid plexus. What the choroid plexus does is it produces cerebrospinal fluid. So if we have a blockage in our anterior choroid artery, we might have a decreased production of cerebrospinal fluid, which could cause other problems. This anterior choroidal artery also supplies the optic tract. This is important for taking visual information to more central areas of the brain. So again, if we have problems with our anterior choroidal artery, we might end up with having problems with our vision. It also supplies parts of the thalamus, the hippocampus, which is involved in memory, and part of the cerebral peduncles. And you remember a peduncle is, again, a big structure of white matter. Okay, so next we have our posterior communicating artery. Oopsie. And let me bring that up so you can see it. Our posterior communicating artery is number 5, and that is going to connect our internal carotid system with our vertebral basilar system. This posterior communicating artery does not have any cortical branches. It does have some deep branches. That supply parts of the thalamus and hypothalamus. Okay, so that is a summary using our diagram of the internal carotid system. Now I'm going to show you a few slides to kind of reinforce and show you different ways of viewing this system. And then in the next video we'll go on to the vertebrobasilar system. So this is the internal carotid system, part of it. So here's our internal carotid artery ascending up. It's going to bifurcate into the anterior cerebral artery, which is shown right here, as well as this middle cerebral artery, which is shown right here. Sorry, I forgot my pointer, so I have to use my finger. And so this middle cerebral artery is going to go on out to lateral areas. But here's those lenticulostriate arteries that jut off at a right angle and go on to supply basal nuclei, which is here. And here's that internal capsule, that huge white matter structure. So remember, we can easily get clots in these because they're so narrow and there's such a right angle here. And so that's going to affect the function of the basal nuclei as well as the internal capsule if that happens. This middle cerebral artery keeps going, and it's going to supply the insula. And the insula is that area of cortex that's deep to the cerebral cortex, other areas, so the parietal cortex as well as the temporal cortex. And then that artery is going to keep going out, and it's going to supply areas out that are lateral in the temporal lobe as well as the frontal and the parietal lobe. So that gives you a coronal section view of those blood vessels, those arteries, just to give you a better idea of what they supply. This is a lateral view showing you the left middle cerebral artery. So that's the one that's coming out here and going to supply all these lateral aspects of the cerebral hemispheres. This also shows the left anterior cerebral artery, but it's a little bit harder to see, but you can see it kind of going anteriorly. It's going to dive into that fissure, and then it's going to supply more medial aspects of the cerebral hemispheres. Why do we care? So I'm going to tell you a little bit of why. So here I have something you're going to learn a lot more about later in the semester. This area right here is the post-central gyrus. You're going to identify that in lab. That's this area right here. And what that area of the brain does is that it processes somatosensory information from your body and your head. And so it turns out that different areas of this cerebral cortex area, this primary somatosensory cortex, process different regions of the body and head. And that's what this is showing over here. So just in general, more lateral areas are going to end up processing information from the face and the upper body, and more medial areas, so this would be a coronal section here, more medial areas are going to process information from the lower limb, as shown here. So what I told you earlier in this video is that our middle cerebral artery and our anterior cerebral artery supply different areas. So the middle cerebral territory is going to supply lateral areas. So if we have one of these vessels here, it'd be right back here, I guess, being blocked, that's going to end up affecting somatosensory sensation from the face or the upper body. In contrast, if instead we have anterior cerebral artery branches being blocked, so maybe this one, we're going to end up having a lack of sensation in our lower limbs. And so this can tell us, based on the person's symptoms, whether they're having trouble feeling in their legs or their arms, and if we know it's a cerebrovascular accident that happens at the cortex, you can actually start to identify which main vessel that blockage is going to be in. So that's why we want to learn about this, is because it can make us detectives so we can figure out what's happening. This shows you the middle cerebral artery supplying the insula. So in this dissection, the part of the frontal lobe, part of the parietal lobe, and part of the temporal lobe has been dissected away, and you can see these vessels that are supplying the underlying insula, which is also a cortical region. So this slide is a summary of those lenticulostriate arteries again, as well as other what are called perforating or ganglionic arteries. So those are arteries that are going to be going deep. So these are the small branches that are going to arise from multiple arteries around the brain, and they're going to dive deep into the structure. And on some brains, you can actually see these perforating, what do they call it? Perforating substance. Yes, perforated substance. And that's going to be, you can see little holes in the brain, and that's where those blood vessels are diving down or dove down when the person was alive into that tissue. So you can read that, but again, these narrow, thin-walled vessels are frequently involved in strokes, and those are what they look like, and the brain tissue actually shows holes where they go through. So this is our cerebral arterial circle. We've gone through this internal carotid system up here in this video, and then in the next video we're going to go through the vertebral basilar system. So I will see you in the next video.